Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 14 of the Late Stage Podcast, a somber episode as we bring the latest news from around the world, looking at it from sort of U.S. progressive standpoint, right? We often get criticized as being lacking in that regard, only being focused myopically on domestic issues, healthcare, and the like. So this is my attempt at expanding people's understanding of what it means to be on the left here. But with that said, we've got obviously this sort of precarious news story of Russia invading and attacking Ukraine. I'm a little late for folks who were waiting for this episode. I apologize. I think you all understand though, right? I was waiting for this news to drop. Constantly, there was this, is war going to happen kind of discussion. And then it became, what's this war going to look like? Is it just a lot of bluster? Apparently not, right? Russia has fully invaded Ukraine by air, land, and sea. Sea through Odessa. They've brought tanks in columns through Crimea into Ukraine. They've bombed. Initially, there were 56 different sites that were bombed. And I don't mean 56 bombs, way more. 56 sites. So one site being bombed repeatedly, right? Bombs, if you watch the news, you've heard bombs dropping in Kiev with some regularity. So it's devastating, no doubt, right? Initially, out of Odessa, there were only, I think it was 6 dead and 7 wounded. But that number has starkly risen. We've seen footage, if you're watching the video, you'll see, I'm going to put it here, of an airport being bombed in Ivano-Frankivsk in Ukraine. There have been apartment buildings brought down, hopefully without anyone in them. There was a huge push for folks to evacuate a lot of cities and move further west, closer to Poland. A lot of things remain to be seen, but one thing that doesn't remain to be seen is devastation, death. Russia has started a war. I think you might want to call it a military incursion. When you have 2 militaries fighting, and there are 2. It's worth noting. Apparently, Russia's gotten a much stronger pushback than they anticipated. There are something like 80 Russian prisoners of war from their attempt to take Kiev, and quite a few casualties on their end too, supposedly. So it's a fight. It's a legitimate war, no doubt. And Ukraine's not just like laying down and letting Russia do what they want, which I think was perhaps what Putin had hoped for most of all. Beyond just casualties and death, right? Russia has incurred sort of massive penalties already economically. Sanctions are incoming, massive sanctions. We talk about SWIFT sanctions, right? They can be taken off the global banking system. But beyond that even, it's important to note, right, their own stock market had dropped 45% by opening, basically. And it's probably dropped further, but I haven't kept following that. I'm not trying to focus on economic news here, but because it stands to reason, right? Folks know that sanctions are incoming. Russia's economy will be destroyed by this, or at least will be heavily impacted. I'm sure. Apologies for New York City sounds, motorcyclists. Anyway. Yeah, a major military incursion. It's happening. It's here. We can no longer hope for de-escalation or for no war at all. Obviously, my thoughts are with the people of Ukraine and hoping that this is speedy and it's done quick and that they suffer minimally. Although with, again, hundreds of casualties already reported, that's not looking great. With that said, now, I think as far as what is appropriate, right? Should NATO exist? Maybe not. Right? It was created to counter the Soviet Union, a giant sort of sprawling empire that was still expansive, still seeking to gain ground wherever it could. And one could easily argue that when you look at Russia today, by most definitions, shouldn't really qualify as a world power. the standard of living is low underneath the likes of Azerbaijan and Thailand. Thailand, significantly less than the standard of living of those who live in Ukraine, for an example, probably a fitting example. So that's not to say that they don't have a right to be a belligerent military actor because they're not a world power. No, nobody should be a belligerent military actor. And we'll get into that in a moment, the kind of U.S. side and how he's pointed to the U.S. hypocrisy as a good reason for him going in. We'll talk about that. The sort of main point here that I think needs to be highlighted is that I'm trying to highlight is that NATO maybe doesn't need to exist anymore. Russia doesn't need to be focused on to the extent that they were, or at least that would have been the guiding logic of being against the likes of a NATO. Now, Putin sort of gives it purpose again. Should the U.S., folks are like, oh, the U.S. should have let Ukraine not join NATO. Ukraine wanted to join NATO. And the reason the folks like Ukraine want to join NATO is because of the belligerence of the likes of Putin. Putin creates the need for a modern NATO, at least existentially for these folks. And if you don't believe me, look at the response from Poland and Hungary, two very far-right governments in Europe, and how they've quickly condemned what Russia has done and come to the side of the U.S. and whomever else. Right? I should say, I guess really the side of the Ukraine. Right? What am I talking about? Geopolitics have infected my brain. But so that is sort of the problem here, right? When you have a new colonial actor of some kind trying to take over countries, that's when the world needs to sort of band together. Now, ideally, it would be the world banding together, not just Ukraine or maybe the US and the UK and the kind of usual suspects, if you will. But where does that leave us, right? So the world should get together and stop Russia from attacking Ukraine. Fine. What does that mean? Well, obviously sanctions are incoming. And I've already said, that the stock market in Moscow is down quite a bit, et cetera. But why? What can we do differently here, right? Well, for starters, it's very important to note that this is not new for Russia or the Soviet Union specifically, right? Now, if you want to look at this method they're using of claiming that the Donbass region, right, where Donetsk and Luhansk are the sort of two regions that are being enveloped by what they're calling Donbass and are sort of insisting become its own quasi-independent state. Now, first of all, for anyone who's a fan of football or soccer, Donetsk is fairly well known vis-a-vis Shakhtar Donetsk, a very successful Ukrainian football club that for years couldn't even play at home because of the war with Crimea and all that. It's a fairly established region of Ukraine. That said, Russia sort of carving out a little piece of Ukraine and calling it a quasi-independent region as the Ukraine pushes to become a part of NATO, again, probably in fear of the likes of a Putin. It raises this question of haven't we seen this before? And we have. In Crimea, more recently, right, in 2014, February of 2014, Russia did something sort of similar. They were like, this is ours. They sort of threatened military operation. And in the end, they just took it. In Georgia, in 2008, August, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, same story, basically. Slight military incursions by Russia, real short-lived, in and out, done. This is sort of now a quasi-independent zone. Same thing happened in Moldova, interestingly. If you've never heard of Transnistria or Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, no, we're not talking about mystical lands from the Avengers or anything like that. These are sort of real places insofar as Russia has decided they are. Transnistria in 92, when Moldova became an independent, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Moldova wanted to join the UN, similar move, right? Just like Ukraine with the EU today. Russia, or the Soviets, or I guess no, Russia, decided there was this region called Transnistria, which they would keep separate from Moldova and kind of maintain minimal control over. And again, it's their way of putting their footprint on the country of Moldova, making sure that there's a region from which they can send folks in to create chaos and essentially keep a lever on the government there and keep them in the satellite of Russia. Nagorno-Karabakh is another example, right? Nagorno-Karabakh, this was established in 1924, right? Sort of heyday of the Soviet Union. That's not even true. It wasn't. It was still sort of in its foundations. But there was this region that was established in Azerbaijan that was kind of a zone from which Russia could maintain some control in the sort of Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict over land there. Now, this flared up again in 2020 because Azerbaijan and Armenia basically went to war, with Azerbaijan claiming this region for themselves. Still, however, Russia is in talks with Armenia to sort of decide what to do with this land, despite the fact that it's de jure Azerbaijani land and that Azerbaijan has gone to war and sort of won it in the theater of combat. Russia is still, manipulating the puppet strings of the region and maintaining a firm grasp on this zone in the name of, I think, being able to sow chaos and having a foothold in, again, a sort of former satellite near its border, right? So this history is fairly well established. It's nothing new, carving out little zones of former countries that are pushing to sort of enter the world's diplomatic forum rather than Russia's, are always hit back by Russia. And apologies, I'm having a little coffee here, but definitely it's a tried and true tactic. Now, with that said, and Putin is he's directly referenced this. He said that the U.S. does this sort of thing all the time, right? This sort of notion of protecting one's backyard is kind of a uniquely American concept. American, right? U.S., not, sorry, folks in South, Central America, North America even, who are not in the U.S. But what does it all mean, right? Like, how do we interpret his calling out hypocrisy on the part of the United States as sort of reflective of how we should view what he's doing in Ukraine? And I think he's right that we should make that comparison. I mean, the reason is that what the U.S. did was incredibly wrong, right? And of course, you can go down as far down south as Chile, right? The United States put Pinochet into power because they didn't like the way that election had gone. Honduras, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, right? There's not a country to our south. I mean, the United States has effectively sealed off an entire hemisphere as its backyard and done a ton of terrible neo-imperialistic or old-school imperialistic crap. United Fruit Company, anyone? So on the one hand, it's like, who are you to criticize Russia? Sure, I mean, I'm in the United States, so I am throwing bricks from a glass house. And a glass house made of very thin, fragile glass. Shards have already been created, no doubt. I would never defend what the United States has done in that sense. And there's, if Putin wants to make that kind of link, the U.S. does it, so I'm okay doing it too. Here's a historical comparison he might not appreciate. Hitler was inspired by Jim Crow USA. His view of developing a master race and subjugating minorities, putting his foot on them and, genociding them for the most part, right? But demeaning, belittling, at least initially making them want out on their own. That was a Jim Crow mirrored concept, meaning he saw what the United States had done to black folks here, African Americans, and decided that's a good way to do it. Now, just because the United States did something similar or, something terrible that he was inspired by, it doesn't mean Hitler got out scot-free, right? He's still like the enemy. In fact, ironically, Putin is using Hitler and Nazis as a means of attacking Ukraine right now. We're going to denazify a country where the president is himself Jewish, had family die in the Holocaust. Yeah, I'm sure you're going to effectively denazify, right? My wife is Russian, and her family fled the Soviet Union because they were Jewish and being persecuted in Russia. So why don't you denazify Russia, pal? With that said, it's again, right? He's not wrong to point out bad things the United States have done, but that's not an excuse for you to do bad things, right? Two wrongs don't make a right. And just like Jim Crow didn't excuse the actions of Hitler, and Hitler still managed to become the greatest evildoer of all time, right? Inspiration for comic book villains and film villains and the like. Putin can probably expect similar treatment if he continues down this line. And frankly, hundreds of civilians dead, city centers being attacked, videos of fathers telling their daughters to go to safety. They're going to try to stay back and protect their land and all that, right? Like, he's creating a narrative. I never thought better of Putin, right? When I thought, oh, we can de-escalate this thing, we can avoid war, it's not because I thought better of Putin. I know Putin's an asshole. I know Putin's a bad guy. But I didn't think he was stupid. And frankly, this is the action of a stupid dude who has no sense of how the world is going to view what he's doing. I have a group chat with mostly folks younger than myself, and they are referring to what Putin was doing and military incursions of the like that we're seeing in Ukraine now as boomer shit. And now, it was one of the few times I've smiled today, because it would be great if war, militaristic war, killing people at that scale were considered kind of passé, old school, whatever. I would love that. Of course, it's not true. And it's important to note also, this isn't the only this isn't the only war happening in the world, and this isn't the only injustice. And I'm going to talk soon about other injustices perpetuated by the United States, just so everyone feels like everyone's getting a little bit. But clearly today's major bad guy is Putin and Russia for attacking people, right? Fairly straightforward. Now, the reason you get a sense that this might be turning in a different direction, and that Putin can't expect pointing at hypocrisy to be sort of his saving grace. Even Japan has imposing sanctions on Russia, banning the issuance of Russian bonds, and this is unprecedented. Japan is a country that historically has been very willing. They might have an opinion on someone's geopolitics or whatever it might be, but they're going to do business with you. When it comes to interactions of finance, when it comes to big business moves, Japan is like doing big business with China. Eternal rival, historical, geopolitical rival, great enemy, China. Japan has done extensive business there. So for them to decide that what Russia's done is so bad that they don't want to do anything, they're done interacting, they're sanctioning, they're willing to sort of throw that under the bus. It really, I think, is a testament to how badly Putin has miscalculated. Now, as far as Japan goes, there's sort of perhaps a kind of ulterior motive. Ulterior sounds quite negative. In this case, it's perhaps justified, right? They probably fear that if what Russia does is allowed, and there's no sort of second guessing or doubting the legitimacy of it, what's to stop, for example, China from doing similar things, right? And China has a number of disputed islands between itself and Japan, Philippines. There's the whole situation with Taiwan and Hong Kong, right? They want more control, or they want Taiwan to sort of bend the knee, right? Russia being allowed to kind of go back into expansive militaristic mode would certainly signal that China could be allowed to do the same. And if we were talking about like the world power status of Russia being somewhat in question, so maybe NATO doesn't necessarily need to exist. But nobody's questioning the world power status of China, right? Although the standard of living in China is not particularly high, as I was pointing out with Russia, their economy is skyrocketing, and there are regions of China where you're truly in the lap of luxury, right? So it's not by any stretch a kind of like for like situation with Russia. Um, and not just China or Russia. I think there's a fear that anyone would signal this as a positive step that they could use to revert to old school warring and take over mechanisms, right? Like Trump was praising Putin and saying we should do this to Mexico so that we could secure the border. I mean, it's stupid because, right, like if you just take over Mexico, then the border just moves further south and there's a new border to secure, supposedly, right? It's the height of stupidity to even suggest one should think that way. But even worse, right, invading Mexico? What? It's never even been on the table. In fact, we still have land of New Mexico, Texas, right? These are regions that we already took from Mexico. We should give them back. That would be hilarious. Obviously, we're not doing that. But anyway, my apologies for the cut there. Had to stop things and let that ambulance pass from the street level down there. Anyway, I think that's about what there is to say about Russia. Yes, Putin's right. It's hypocritical for folks in the U.S. who supported terrible regime change and stuff to criticize what he's doing on the one hand. But on the other hand, right, two wrongs don't make a right. And I think anyone who was critical of what the U.S. was doing, and that's much of the world, has every right to be critical of what Putin's doing, what Russia's doing. And I hope they apply that same critical lens. Let's move on. And we'll come back to China in a little bit. Some talk of China and Australia. So first of all, for anyone who's looking for another bad guy, or, like, oh, well, if Russia's so bad, what about the U.S.? Fine. Let's talk about the U.S. And let's talk a little bit about that hypocrisy, right? So, oh, you're so worried about Ukrainians and what's going to happen to them. Well, what about the wars that are happening elsewhere, like right now, as we speak? The ones that the United States is in part responsible for. Let's talk about that. Yemen. And again, the United States has done something bad. In Yemen, Biden's administration has applied further sanctions, and this time he's applying sanctions to all what he calls Houthi financiers, people providing finance to the Houthis. Now, here's the problem. The Houthis are in power in the vast majority of Yemen, right? That's the kind of rebel unit, and they've removed the former source of power there that was aligned with the Saudis, and therefore that's why the Saudis are in there attacking, right? Sort of helping old alliances and whatnot. But the Houthis are in the vast majority, and so sanctioning Houthi financiers is essentially sanctioning their entire economy. And what you're doing is you're sanctioning an economy of people where there's already a humanitarian crisis, mass starvation, people suffering. And so the United States is adding to that suffering in the name of helping their buddies, Saudi Arabia, who just announced they're not going to do anything about the price of oil again because they want it to create unrest. They don't want Biden or Democrats in power in the United States, and so they want to unsettle the populace here by making them pay more for gas and making it look like it's Biden's fault so that we can have more internal crises to blame him for. But that's fine. We'll look past that. Let's just keep funding this war on Yemen. In fact, let's punish the people who are starving to death further in the name of helping these buddies in Saudi Arabia, right? So look, there it is. There's your false equivalent. If you want to be mad at the United States for its military incursions and you want to overlook Russia, you have some reason to be mad today also. On the other hand, we could just look at this as just a couple of bad guys doing their usual shtick and people on both sides fighting about, my evil step cousin is better than yours. Well, you both got evil step cousins and they're causing havoc. Let's get this all in check and stop with the militarism, folks. As my friend said, that's some boomer shit. I gotta say, it's boomer shit. Real quickly, before I fully move on from Ukraine and all that, it's worth noting that the regions I spoke of, kind of Avengers like Transnistria and Abkhazia and South Ossetia, right, and stuff like that, right? Like, and specifically Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they're only recognized by 5 nations in the world at the UN. So these are not, these little pockets of land that the the Russians are trying to create where they can kind of create havoc from. These are only recognized by Nauru, which was a small Pacific and oceanic nation. But then you have Nicaragua, Russia, Syria, and Venezuela. So Nicaragua and Venezuela are 2 countries that have been thoroughly impacted by the United States doing the same stuff to them. So I think for them, it's a little bit more of a reactionary, like, we'll support these guys in the name of, like, who are you to say what they should do when you're doing that to us, kind of, dumb reactionary politics. Let's be honest. As for Russia, we don't have to go too far into that, or Syria, right? We know what they're up to vis-a-vis Assad. So, yeah, not as far as like the world's opinion goes, right? Not even China has recognized some of these states. So for Russia, hoping that they're going to create some like new world order where they can push back against the US and perpetuate the same sort of malevolent land grabs that the US has done historically, I think they're mistaken. I think they've really underestimated the extent to which the world is tired of seeing people suffering. I mean, after all this COVID stuff, you think the world needs a world war? I don't know, Putin. I think it's time to hire a new council or whoever it is that he's taking advice from. Anyway, let's try to move on quickly from this. There's a little bit of good news. So, I talked again about Ukraine as the main storyline. Obviously, then there's Yemen, which is a sort of another sad sort of footnote to it all. Now, a little bit of good news. We'll go to Oceania, as I've promised before. And we did last week, I talked about Canberra. So specifically in Canberra. Last episode, we talked, sorry again, about the siren cut up. We talked about how the trucker convoy had spread from Canada to various other places. And I specifically highlighted Canberra, Australia, because they were having issues with, wading around in human feces. They were having issues with pink eye, foot fungus, right? They were really struggling to fruitlessly revolt against something that was fairly logical to begin with. But despite that, and I guess we'll do the bad news first. We'll stay in Canberra and their parliamentary system. There's news out of the New York Times, right, about like dirty money in Australian politics, and they're talking about like some of the dirtier stuff, like coal barons buying climate change warrior, folks who present themselves as fighting against climate change and like being pro-environment and all that, and they're being bought out by coal barons. And then you have what they're referring to as Chinese dark money, people financing politicians and what have you. And of course, again, right, while we're on this whole backyard subject, right, I suppose Australia is technically part of China's backyard. And so it shouldn't be entirely surprising that they'd want to sort of have an impact on Australian politics. And with that said, I feel like the framing of that story is a little weird insofar as what they're describing is the US political system. Dark money, coal barons buying climate change. I mean, that, like Joe mentioned, hello, right? We've literally been able to just keep hurting the environment in the name of this dude making money from his coal investments. Like, I don't even think it's shadier insofar as he owns companies that are directly profiting. Like literal corruption. But sorry, coffee again, folks. But what's I think pivotal here in understanding the way this is framed is, so to refer to Chinese dark money infiltrating Australian politics, right? Again, look at the United States. Look at Saudi Arabia. Look at Israel. Look at, India, right? There are so many countries that have huge lobbies in the United States who, are putting dark money into the U.S. political. No, we don't refer to it like that. We refer to it as lobbying. It's all above the table and totally okay, and even the stuff that's not quite above the table, right? It's, well, of course, there's geopolitics involved. You can't be so forthright with it all, and right? So we're willing to excuse this very same behavior when it comes to our quote unquote allies or folks who are trying to get the U.S. system to perpetuate whatever it wants in the global sphere of geopolitics. But when other countries do the same, it's considered something else. Is that racism? I don't know. Is that sort of jingoism and hypocrisy? Absolutely. So yeah, there's that's my pushback to a narrative being written about Australia. Not to say that like money in politics is good. Again, right? Two wrongs don't make a right. But it's not new or novel or even probably worthy of a lot of attention in this case, because that's politics today. That's capitalism, I dare say, right? Money buys politicians. I mean, honestly, maybe that's socialism. It seems to be the problem with our world for the most part. But anyway, let's not overdo it. Now, finally, I'm gonna wrap things up on some good news, specifically with Australia, since I'm already there. They have opened up, and those mandates, the truckers getting foot fungus and whatnot can have a squeal of joy. No, it's not true. They're not opening up fully. They've opened up for tourists, however. And so that's good news for any surfers out there or any fans of throwing in a shrimp on the barbie. Sorry about my terrible accent. But, if anyone who's an Australia-phile, you can go back. Of course, it's not entirely easy. Vaccine mandates, right? Declarations for customs. You have to be real forthright about your scenario. You have to be tested thoroughly. So it's not like anyone can just get up and go to Australia. You still have to go through some thorough processes. But yeah, the good news is that, especially for Australia and tourism, right, they're back in business. So I'm using that story to highlight the fact that, on the one side of things, COVID is finally, it seems like, relenting. And of course, cross your fingers, knock on wood, who knows? There could be another variant. With COVID, one should never be too comfortable. But it's also to highlight the fact that we've finally maybe come out from underneath one terrible situation and we're right into another one, vis-a-vis war, perhaps of a global scale, hopefully not. Belligerent imperialists having the swinging their junk around. But so yeah, that's the bad news, obviously. But so yeah, that's it for the news today. Quickly, I'll do my weird of the week, and this week it's a repeat offender. If anyone is aware of fucker Carlson's attempts to support Vladimir Putin, he's getting my weirdo of the week for it, because I think it's incredibly disingenuous and weird. Mr. Anti-war right, populist right, we don't like war anymore, supporting the dude who's going to war in the name of just terrible things. And I guess, to be fair, I'm sure Tucker Carlson also was a fan of Pinochet and the U.S. getting him anything that helps the far right. He seems to be a fan of. His defense of Putin was like, "Oh, he's never called me a racist." I mean, this is a dude, vis-a-vis Mr. Carlson, who has said the 14 words, the white nationalist credo, on air. So if Putin hasn't called you racist, that's more of a knock against Putin than it is a compliment. So take that for what it is. Ultimately, what it is this guy is a weird creep who supports a dictator in Russia because it hurts the Democrats. Sorry again for that cut. Again, sirens. New York is not relenting today. But so yeah, like I said, Carlson is trying to own the libs by supporting a maniacal would-be dictator who is bombing and killing innocent people as we speak. So that's how far you're willing to go to own the libs. Have at it, friend, but you are certainly my weirdo of the week for it. Guess he didn't call him a racist, though, so there's that. Anyway, I think that's about it for our news this week. As always, follow us on Twitter at LateStageTrib, TRIB. Follow myself at Sir_Rights_a lot. Follow us on Instagram, Late Stage Tribune, one word. And as always, hopefully when we're back next week, we'll return with better news, which I wish it was like, because the news was so good, maybe we can even top that. But no, as usual, bad news all around. And so hopefully we'll just get some respite. But until then, peace out, everyone.